Hi friends, welcome to another Sunday with Sarah. I'm Sarah Baldwin and today I'm coming to you from my kitchen at home in Maine, and I am going to share with you how to make kindergarten bread. This is the bread recipe that I used when I was a Waldorf teacher in my kindergarten class. And as I've talked about in other videos, I've talked about the rhythm of the day and the rhythm of the week. And in most Waldorf kindergartens, early childhood programs, there is a rhythm to the week in terms of the food and the snacks we eat. So in my classroom, Monday was rice day, Tuesday was soup day, Wednesday was bread day, Thursday was millet day, and Friday was oat day. So every Wednesday we would bake bread, and it's really easy. If you have not made bread before, I'm going to show you how easy it is. You only need a few ingredients. So let's start with our ingredients. To make bread using this recipe, you're going to need white bread flour. I like King Arthur's unbleached white bread flour, and we're going to make our recipe with half white flour and half whole wheat, and this is King Arthur's whole wheat flour. I apologize to those of you who have families with gluten intolerance or celiac. This is not the recipe for you. But it's a wonderful recipe that children like, that it's not too heavy, it's not all whole wheat. I like the mixture of half and half. You'll also need some honey and salt and yeast. And you can also add to your recipe, you can add secret ingredients like cinnamon and other optional ingredients. You could add raisins or dried currants, sunflower seeds, millet. If you have any leftover oatmeal, you can add oatmeal to your bread dough. It's really easy. Whatever you have on hand, you can spice it up with some special secret ingredients. So ideally, you would begin the preparation the day before to give the bread, sponge we call it, time to the yeast to activate. You can do it the same day, but I always like to do this part the day before. And I'm going to start with the yeast. I'm going to take about a cup of lukewarm water, not cold, not hot. Actually, about half a cup is probably fine. And you're going to add about a teaspoonful of honey. The sugar in the honey is what feeds the yeast. I'm going to stir the honey in. And then I'm going to need about a teaspoon of yeast powder. I prefer to buy yeast in jars. It's easier to measure, but today I just have the packets on hand. This is Fleischmann's yeast that you can find in any grocery store. So about a teaspoon, and I just sprinkle the yeast on top of the water. And then I put it aside in a warm place for about 15 minutes and to let it get frothy. Now this will test your yeast to make sure the yeast cultures are still active when it gets foamy. If nothing happens, if you have yeast that's been in your refrigerator a long time and it just sinks to the bottom, it doesn't get foamy, then your yeast might not be fresh and might not be good. So I'm going to put this aside in a warm place. And I have another one here that I've already prepared so you can see what it looks like after 15-20 minutes. It'll get all frothy like that. And then we're going to make our sponge. And to do that, I'm going to use about 3 cups of warm water. Again, not too hot and definitely not cold. And I always say to test, to make sure your water is not too hot, you ought to be able to hold your finger in it comfortably for about 10 seconds without having to pull your finger out. And this temperature is just right. So next I am going to take a wooden spoon. I'm very proud of this wooden spoon. This is a spoon that my son Harper carved for me in his woodworking class when he was at a Waldorf school. I think in 7th or 8th grade. And I used it in my kindergarten for many years, and now I have it at home with me and still using it. So I'm going to take about a wooden spoonful of honey. You'll see that this recipe isn't exact. It's very forgiving. You don't need exact measurements. So what I'm doing here with using 3 cups of water, we're going to make these into rolls. I'll explain more why later. But this would probably make 2 loaves of bread if you want to make loaves. It will make, I would say, 6 to 12 rolls, depending on how big your rolls are. And if you want to make more, if you want to prepare bread with a class full of children, you might want to use 5 cups of water. If you're just making it at home, if you have only 1 child, you might want to start with just 2 cups of water. But the lovely thing is, if you make too much bread, you can always freeze it and have it later. So now to this I'm going to add, here's my, honey and water. And I'm just going to add about a teaspoonful of salt. And mix in the salt. And then I'm going to add the yeast mixture. And now we're ready to start adding the flour. So I'm going to start with a cup of white flour. Now at this point I'd have the children helping me. I didn't bring one home from Bella Luna Toys, but we sell little children's sifters, and I would use those in my kindergarten class, and the children loved to, we would say, make it snow into the bowl, and they would sift the flour into the bowl. We'll just sprinkle it in like this. And then I'm going to alternate and add, I have more whole wheat flour in here. So I'm going to add a cup of whole wheat flour. This is smaller than the bowl I usually use. You'll see my other bowl in a minute. But I want to stir this up until it becomes the consistency of thick mud. So this is still kind of lumpy, and it's not yet like thick mud. So I'm going to add another cup of white flour. Again, the sifter helps prevent it from getting so lumpy. And you can just press out some of the lumps with your spoon against the edge of the bowl. Once it gets thicker, we'll stir all those lumps out. And I'll add another cup of whole wheat. So this is, here I've used about 2 cups of white flour and 2 cups of whole wheat. And now it's getting to be about the consistency you want. One of my cups of white flour is a little scant, so I'm just going to add a little bit more. All right, that's looking like thick mud to me. So once we get to this point and it's like thick mud, we stir it for for 100 stirs, and this is a great activity to ask kids to help with. So if you have older children who can count to 100, they love to do this. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 4, 55, 56, 57, 58, 59, 60. And if your hands are getting tired, or you can have children take turns. So each child could count to 10, say. So we're at 60, 61, 62, 63, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99, 100. So I always say in a Waldorf kindergarten, we're not actively teaching reading and writing and arithmetic, but through real life skills and practical work like this, like baking bread, we're practicing counting, we're practicing math. And this making bread is a wonderful science activity. The way the yeast makes the bread rise and the transformation of substance, they're all pre-science lessons, but in a way that has real meaning for children. It's not abstract. So this is the preparation for the sponge, as we call it. This is what you're going to do the day before. However, if you're pressed for time, you could just let this sit for an hour or two. You could prepare it in the morning and then, say around 8 o'clock and 10 a.m., do the next step, which I'm going to show you. I've covered this with a wet cloth, and I'm going to put it aside in a warm place. So ideally, I would do this overnight. I would usually prepare this at the end of the day before bread day. We'd set it aside, and then the next morning we'd be ready to bake the bread. Okay, so I'm going to put this aside in a warm place, but over here I have a sponge that I prepared yesterday that's ready to go. So let's pretend it's the next morning, and you'll see the yeast has been hard at work, and the sponge, it's called a sponge because if you see, it looks kind of like a sponge with all those big holes, bubbles in it. So I'm going to give it a stir. Sometimes it can get kind of separate, the liquid can get separate from the flour. And all we do now is keep alternating, adding white flour and whole wheat flour until it becomes the consistency of dough that can be kneaded. And you'll know it's ready when the sides of the dough start pulling, the dough starts pulling away from the sides of the bowl. And again, the children can use little sifters here to keep adding the flour bit by bit while another child stirs. And this is going to get thicker and thicker and harder to stir. So again, it's wonderful to let children take turns when their arm gets tired, or if you're just baking bread alone with one child, you have a turn and your child has a turn. You want to be careful here that you don't add too much flour all at once, that it becomes too thick and too hard to knead. And this is a point too where you could add any of your secret optional ingredients. I have some cinnamon right here. If I had raisins, you could make cinnamon raisin bread. And now the dough is starting to pull away from the sides, but I can tell it's still a little too wet. And I forgot to say something very important. Before I started this part mixing the bread dough, I've already preheated my oven to 350 degrees. So remember to do that before you do this step of getting the dough ready to knead. Now, if you've baked bread before, you're probably used to letting the dough rise and punching it down and letting it rise and punching it down. You can do that if you want, but I found with this recipe, you really don't have to. By letting that sponge do its magic overnight, this recipe, once you've made it into your loaves or your rolls, you can let it rise a little bit before you put it into the oven. But this is a very forgiving recipe. And it's pretty hard to fail. Okay, that is getting there. It's getting really thick and hard to stir. It's still a little wet, still going to need more flour. At this point, sometimes I just add a little bit more by hand. And then the last part is going to be easier to do when you put it out on the table. So let me move these things out of the way. So this we just did right on our tables, the tables we would eat at in our kindergarten class, and I just put flour out. Sometimes I would put a little flour at each child's place. Say like so. And then I would make a little spiral for them. And I might sing a little song to tell them it's time to come to the table and make the dough. I might sing, "This is the way we bake the bread, bake the bread, bake the bread. This is the way we bake the bread on a cold and frosty morning." For our purposes, I'm just spreading it out here because first I'm going to just add a little more flour and knead this a little bit so it's exactly the consistency that I want. So it's not, you don't want it sticky like this at all. You don't want it to stick to your fingers. You just gradually add flour till it loses that stickiness. And right now it's really soft and pliable. And so if you've never kneaded bread before, you kind of turn it a quarter of the way around, and then I kind of fold over one edge. You want air to get in there, so I'm folding it over and then pushing from the edge with my hands. Then I turn it a quarter of a turn, fold it over and push, and so on until it becomes very elastic. And then I might sing, "This is the way we knead the dough, knead the dough, knead the dough. This is the way we knead the dough on a cold and frosty morning." It's still a little sticky here. "This is the way we knead the dough, knead the dough, knead the dough. This is the way we knead the dough on a cold and snowy morning." Whatever the weather is that day. On a warm and sunny morning. Okay, now at this point, it's not too sticky. I would do all of this kneading up to this part, and then I would just break off a piece, a roll-size piece for each child, and give each child his or her own little piece of dough to knead, and we would sit together at the table. You want to try to make them fairly consistent sizes. It doesn't matter whether they're big rolls or small rolls. I would take the big rolls and we would just slice them like bread, but the reason I like making rolls in class better than loaves of bread Well, for one, it gives the children opportunity to each have their piece of dough to knead. And also it cooks faster, so it would be ready for our snack time. It bakes faster. So then the children would be sitting at their places kneading, and I might sing, see how Aiden pushes the dough. He pushes and pushes and pushes the dough. See how Aiden pushes the dough on a cold and frosty morning. See how Annika pushes the dough. She pushes and pushes and pushes the dough. See how Annika pushes the dough on a cold and frosty morning. And I should say that before we started, I had child-size aprons, and we also have those at Bella Luna Toys. You could have one for your child at home. We'd all put our aprons on. So on bread morning, I would have each place set up, each chair with an apron draped on it, and I would prepare by having these little spirals of flour ready to knead. And since I don't have any child helpers today, I'm just going to finish kneading this dough myself. So you want it to be elastic. If you knead it too long, the dough will start to get kind of hard and tough. If you feel that happening, it's time to stop. It should still feel fairly soft. And so now I am just going to make these into rolls again. I'm still finding some stickiness here. I'm finding myself rushing a little bit because I don't want this video to be too long, but when you're baking bread with children, you want to give children the sense that you have all the time in the world. Just be in the present, and this is just such a wonderful activity, this pushing, and it engages a child's senses. It's a sensory experience. It's a practical experience where they're learning a real life skill. They're learning where food comes from. And they're participating in a group activity that we will all share together, social activity when we sit down and eat our bread. So on like that. You want the finished rolls to look pretty smooth. More like this, and not with so many cracks. Like this. So now the children are done kneading their bread. They'll usually at this point get up and go off to play. I might find that some rolls need a little more help than others. Some children have stronger hands than others. So I might give them just a few little pushes, kneads with the heel of my hand, and shape them until they're ready to be put on a cookie sheet. Now when you preheat your oven to 350 degrees before you begin the kneading, you might want to oil your cookie sheet or baking sheet. I have non-stick baking sheets, but otherwise you want to put a little oil on them. At this point, I would put them on the cookie sheet, and if I have the time, I'm going to let them rise for anywhere half an hour, 45 minutes, up to an hour before you put them in the oven. Okay, now I'm ready to put them in the oven. You'll want to set a timer for, I would recommend 45 minutes. They're going to take about 45 minutes to an hour to bake, depending on how large your rolls are. If they're smaller, less time. If they're bigger, it could take up to an hour. Once your timer goes off, you'll take a look at them, and once they've started to get golden brown on the top, and if you knock on one, it will sound hollow in the middle. You'll know they're done. So I'm going to let these bake. I'll see you in about an hour. Okay, here are our finished rolls. Do you see how much they grew? Now I know they're done. They're only slightly brown on top, but the reason I know they're done is when I knock on them, I hear that hollow sound. You hear that? I wish you could smell how good my kitchen smells right now. There is just nothing like the smell of freshly baked bread. So when I have these, you see these are rather large rolls, the way we would serve them. They're really like mini loaves. And I would cut them into pieces like so. And sometimes I would have a child help me butter them. We used to make honey butter that we churned ourselves on another day, and that'll be another video I'll share with you soon. Show you how easy it is to churn your own butter and what a great activity that is for kids. But we'd butter the bread. And then put all the pieces in a basket, which we would then pass around the table and share, or I might have a child serve and bring the basket and let each child choose a piece of bread. That gets a little tricky sometimes when pieces are all different sizes. Not so important, but try it. So good. It's been a long time since I've had kindergarten bread. So that's how easy it is. I hope if you've never baked bread before that you'll be inspired to try. It's just really such a wonderful activity to share with your children. You could make it a weekly bread day like we had in our kindergarten. After bread day came soup day. You might have seen one of my other videos on how to make stone soup. And we would have our leftover bread, we would heat it up the next day and eat it with our stone soup. The nice thing is, however much of this bread you don't eat or these rolls, you can just stick them in the freezer and just warm them up and have them another time. So let me know if you find these tutorial videos helpful. If you'd like to see more, let me know. As always, I appreciate your comments and questions. Again, I apologize to those of you who are gluten-free. I will try to find another recipe for a gluten-free bread to share with you another time. Don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't already. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.